So good day, good afternoon, good morning. My name is Sebastian Bruns. I'm a senior researcher at ISPK and also a senior associate with the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, Washington, D.C. It's my pleasure to welcome you today to our virtual roundtable celebrating the 40th anniversary of the publication of Tom Clancy's The Hunt for Red October. This one, in case you missed it. For those in the audience who are attending one of our events for the first time, a brief commercial break. The Institute for Security Policy at Kiel University, ISPK, is an independently funded, not-for-profit research institution and think tank, which is focusing on the analysis of contemporary security policy challenges. Accordingly, ISPK has set itself the task of contributing to the security policy discourse in Germany and abroad with policy and practice-oriented research and teaching. While we organize and host major conferences such as the Kiel International Seapower Symposium, our flagship, we also have events on other areas of the world. We host Indo-Pacific conferences and also the Baltic Sea Security Forum. At the same time, we've also been known to explore the intersection of security and defense problems through various workshops, roundtables, podcasts, naval history formats, and we even publish a weekly fleet tracker that shows what the German Navy is up to. And we've turned the results of that fleet tracker into a card game, which was just published 2 weeks ago. For more information on the work of ISPK, please follow, if you're on Twitter, please follow at ISPK_org. Find our academic director, Dr. Sarah Kirchberger, on LinkedIn, or visit our website, www.ispk.org and www.kielseapowerseries.com. On to the subject matter. The year is 1984. It is the height of the Second Cold War, a period in which superpower relations between the United States of America and the Soviet Union dramatically soured. Just 1 year prior, in 1983, dubbed by some historians as, quote, the most dangerous year of the Cold War, a number of crises had brought East and West at arm's length of a hot war. President Ronald Reagan, who had cruised into the presidency on a strong foreign policy and national security platform, faced a succession of aging Russian leaders. In this context, a Maryland insurance salesman by the name of Tom Clancy had convinced the US Naval Institute Press to publish his and their first work of fiction, The Hunt for Red October. Popularized by President Reagan's casual reference to the book, and more so, the 1990 movie adaptation featuring Sean Connery as the Soviet submarine's captain Marco Ramius, and Alec Baldwin as civilian naval analyst, who should have written that memo instead, Dr. Jack Ryan, and the novel became instant hits with wide audiences. Here with us today are three speakers who will shed some light on the book, the subject matter at hand, and its enduring influence and relevance. First, we will hear from Dr. Keith Bird. Keith has published extensively on German naval and military history, including the indispensable German Naval History, A Guide to the Literature. He is the former chancellor of the Kentucky Community and Technical College system in Versailles, Kentucky. He studied at the Free University in Berlin as a Fulbright scholar after earning his PhD from Duke University, and he received a German fellowship to the Military History Research Office in Freiburg. Our second speaker is Lieutenant Commander Dr. Benjamin Griffin. I'm very grateful that he has agreed to be on today's panel. For one, he's the author of the critically acclaimed book, Reagan's War Stories, A Cold War Presidency, this one. It's published by Naval Institute Press in 2022, so 38 years after Clancy, and is a book that I strongly recommend to everyone here. Second, Lieutenant Commander Griffin is currently the chief of the Military History Division at the United States Military Academy. He's a military intel officer who graduated from West Point in 2006, held a variety of intelligence-related positions, and, among others, served two tours to Iraq. Ben holds a PhD in history from the University of Texas, along with a master's in history from the same, and a master's in international security studies from the University of Arizona. Now, as some of you might know, I myself was a professor at that other academy, the one with the 62-55 winning record in football. Thus, I am contractually obliged to say go Navy, beat Army. Seriously, though, one of my professional regrets while I was at the Naval Academy in Annapolis was that a trip to West Point never did materialize due to the pandemic. So Ben, thanks very much for being on the panel today. Last but not least, our third speaker is Captain Retired Michael Setzer, President of the German Submariners Association, a position he assumed in December 2016. Michael joined the West German Bundesmarine in 1976 and, to the surprise of exactly nobody, is a career submariner. After 3 tours in other positions, he held command of U-27 and U-14 before assuming staff duties at the submarine flotilla. Ashore, he taught naval warfare at the German Armed Forces Staff Command College in Hamburg. He advised on NATO and European Union matters. He commanded both the state territorial military commands of Brandenburg and Hamburg, and served as naval attaché in Washington, D.C. Welcome back to ISPK, Michael. With that, I will turn over to our 3 speakers who will give about 10 minutes, 10, 15 minutes at the most of their perspectives on Hunt for Red October, and then we will have time for Q&A. Please make yourself known through the chat function if you have a question. Remember, again, this session is going to be on the record. In fact, it will be posted on our YouTube channel and will sit neatly beside the similar virtual roundtable that we conducted on Das Boot in 2022. Gentlemen, fire away, but remember, 1 ping only.
Put my timer on because I'm looking forward to the discussion, and a lot of my comments about the book and the film easily can come under the discussion. But the purpose of my introductory comments is just to present a broader context for viewing the Hunt for Red October and the development and elements of what we call a universal cultural historical phenomena called the submarine mythos that emerged during the World Wars when undersea warfare first played a significant role, and the influence of the submarine mythos that was reflected in the groundbreaking books that Sebastian has already mentioned, both the book and the film. And I can tell you from my reading of the book in preparation for this session that I must not have read it since 40 years ago, because it was almost like finding a whole new publication. Then I begin to remember it, but it's quite distinct. So if you're going to follow up this session, I would suggest that a rereading of the book and the movie is absolutely essential. They're 2 important works, I think, that don't diminish and actually add to the wealth of our discussion that we're going to have. The Hunt for Red October, John Buchanan's and blockbuster film adaptation, is regarded as the foundation and template of the modern techno-thriller genre, just as Das Boot was recognized as the gold standard of the submarine genre, film genre. In terms of why this topic is so important is, as I was doing my research, it quickly led me to understand and look closer at the whole new age that we're in, the age of great power competition along with regional players and their proxies. And there are also a number of research papers growing concern about the future of the submarine beyond just the numbers and construction capabilities for existing and projected new types, but also how are submarines going to deal with the challenges of disruptive technology, including drones, new detection capabilities. That one of the people whose research paper I read was projecting that the oceans would become transparent by 2050. And of course, what implications does that have for our changes in how we look at the submarine as a whole, the submarine mythos, as I was saying. But the public's fascination with all things U-boat and submarine in general, I mean, it's always had a tremendous background in terms of humanity's idea of exploring the sea. We can go back, of course, to 1870 and Captain Nemo and the Nautilus. Certainly that has continued in terms of public interest, to the submarine's role in undersea warfare, which became part of the public imagination and nightmares. Actually, it even started before the First World War as submarines were developed, but it became a weapon of total war in that period, directed not just against warships, but against an enemy's economy. This situation has become even threatening with what one of my interviewees said was really a new Cold War that I would probably date at least back to 2005, when Putin decided to build back Russia's submarine force in a very significant way, and also his emphasis on developing new technologies, weapons technologies. And of course, we have the Chinese buildup, so forth. And again, the submarine mythos encompassed the complex relationship between the submarines and submariners, history, reality, its culture, its imagination and identity, including all these aspects of aesthetic aspects, psychological, societal, symbolic, and technological dimensions. In short, a study of the submarine mythos cuts across everything from warfare, contemporary history, and policy and politics, as we'll hear from our next speaker, especially for its expression in literature and film, cultural memory, and other historical expressions, and how they intersect. It is important to point out that the term mythos used here is in its broader context as distinguished from perhaps the more pejorative term of myth, distinguished from exaggeration or legends, particularly the 1939-1945 war, U-boat war, which is a battle nearly won or nearly lost, depending on your perspective. A number of the post-1990 account of the Cold War, which really followed the showing of the movie in 1991, is, and I could probably include the Red Star Rogues, conspiracy theories around the K-129 and its recovery by the Glomar Explorer, of which a host of books have been written. But all of these myths and all of these books, and I now have probably 2 shelves full of Cold War books, the most recent one being published last year, involving the Mediterranean and the search for Soviet submarines. But these myths, as I said, help the public's enthusiasm, the popularity of it. Certainly the films that we've seen in the last several years, from U-571 to the Widowmaker K-19, they've all added to that. I should also point out that there are many parallels between World War II's U-boat war and the Cold War, particularly in the technology race, the race in terms of code breaking and cryptology. There was actually a period in the 1960, before the Cuban Missile Crisis, where actually, similar in 1942, it became suddenly impossible to detect by radio signals Russian submarines. They were using the short burst technology that was introduced late in the Second World War by the Germans. So the German scientists helping the Russians at that point were able to adapt that technology, and a full-scale effort was put into place. It's the same thing with Soviet submarine development. Because of the introduction of the nuclear submarine, which changed really the whole aspect of undersea warfare, its stealth and so forth, that it really had to be addressed. And so shortcuts were taken. You could say shortcuts were taken both on the US side and the Russian side. Although when I got into studies of how many Russian submarines suffered nuclear problems and other construction problems because they were quickly done, and it becomes a much worse problem than the loss of the Thresher or certainly the Scorpion. Although even the causes of those are still controversial, certainly in the case of the Scorpion. The powerful medium of film, despite dramatic license geared to specific audiences, provides us with a virtual dimension visual dimension of the book. And sound is also a very important part of the film, of the submarine mythos, not just the soundtrack, but the film captures through its sound the acoustic environment of the submarine, from alarms and other noises from the ship's systems and the ocean, especially passive and active sonar, which along with radio intercepts and cryptology allow submarines to track the acoustic signatures of their enemies. A key part of history and technology tactics, as well as adding suspense to any dramatic representation of underseas warfare. And of course, the one ping only. A key moment of tension in Red October, if not one of the symbols of the submarine mythos. And by the way, both films were up for Academy Awards, and obviously Red October won them for really its best sound mixing, as did, I think there were 6 Academy Awards for Das Boot. Among the central themes, though, in the submarine mythos, besides the fascination, or better, in the case of Tom Clancy, obsession of technology, is certainly a trademark of Red October and other Tom Clancy novels and nonfiction and role-playing multi-scenario books and games. Other elements of the submarine mythos reflect the submarine's ability to evoke fear. The images of the steel sharks or gray wolves rising stealthily from the depths, and the uncertainty and psychological fears of the submariners as they fight the enemy from above and below, as well as the sea itself. Ocean pressure, crush depth, underwater collisions, of which we had many, and of course, equipment malfunctions in the complex system of submarines, which we see in Red October, as well as the threat from saboteurs and traitors from within and outside the boat itself. Again, all of these elements reflected in Tom Clancy's work, in fact, even in Das Boot. We see a significant representation of close comradeship among the submarine community, whose crews face constant danger and must work together. That must really makes them part of an elite fighting force, recognized by their enemies and fellow warriors, even if their special operations in the Cold War have largely been kept secret and are still classified in some instances by the US and certainly by Russia, except for that brief moment. Remember our peace dividend we had? The universality of the submarine mythos is evident today in the seemingly endless publication of scholarly and popular literature, particularly the 1939-45 U-boat campaign. The literature is endless from all the works that I've seen. And we have endless fan clubs, television. The power of the internet has intensified all these things, websites. And one author suggested just go to Wikipedia and look up submarine and see how many entries you get. It's quite overwhelming. And fascination intensified in the late 1990s as Clancy's fictional account of Soviet and American underseas intelligence operations shook US intelligence as to whether he had access to classified information that detailed the risky espionage and intelligence gathering. I know that personally myself, as I talked to somebody in the late 70s that I met at the Naval Academy, who was in underseas warfare of the Defense Intelligence Agency, and I made a mention about using satellites to detect plankton movement as a way of detecting Soviet subs. And after he hung up on me, called me back later, he said, "How do you know that?" And I said, "New York Times." So you see, it was the sources, the inspiration for Tom Clancy's book, and there's been a number of suggestions. The most powerful one is the attempted 1975 deflection of a Soviet anti-submarine frigate. Although that actually was part of Soviet disinformation, because the political officer on board the frigate was actually seeking to come back and bring the ship back from in the direction of Sweden is where they were traveling to Leningrad to make a public announcement talking about the corrupt Brezhnev government and how Marxist-Leninism had been betrayed. So it was originally done when Tom Clancy read it in the Nimitz Library, I believe, when he read the copy of the thesis that the author had done. That was the story. Since then, it has been republished in 2005 as The Last Century, the true story that inspired the hunt for Red October. Of course, we all know that the real inspiration for Red October was probably no doubt Top Gun, which was 1986, and the Navy wanted to cash in on doing the same thing, Michael, in terms of recruitment in Top Gun as it did for pilot recruitment, and hope that the Red October would do it for submariner recruitment. I tried to find those figures as we did with Das Boot until you found them for me. But I haven't gotten, because we had a lot of drawbacks, and so I couldn't distinguish which were, did we have more recruits for the submariners. And then, of course, the other event that did occur, we did have newspaper releases about the sinking and recovery in 1975 on the K-129, which again might have been a source for Tom Clancy. I certainly would like to know in the book how they turned up finding a S-20 missile, ballistic missile planted. I went back and searched for it several times. I haven't found it, but I don't know if there's a connection there. A final point, let's see, that I think is going to be talked about more by Ben, but while Bookheim and the Clancy books and films reflected the fundamental elements of the submarine mythos, they mirrored the period in which they originated. Bookheim, as you know, was a former Kriegsmarine war reporter and artist. He challenged the mythologizing of the romantic, nearly one elite band of brothers fighting really a hopeless, brutal, and horrible conflict with U-boat crews as victims led by incompetent leaders. The ensuing controversy, bolstered by new academic scholarship from the 1970s, 1980s, played a really important part in Germany's cultural identity at that time, and for actually several decades, and helped accelerate the new post-war generation, German generation, coming to terms with its history. Although, as you can see in the popular literature today, these old myths still are very, very much in evidence. One author that I talked to actually said it was basically even between the two views. Looking closer at the Clancy's first book, and of course the movie, my first comment is, as I've mentioned, is that it's much more, the book is much more complex in terms of its plot. I think and Clancy was much more satisfied with the film adaptation. He had some criticism, but certainly compared to Bookheim, who basically hated the film, Das Boot, and even wanted to write his own script and produce that. So there was quite a difference there. But this is not the case of saying the book is better than the movie or vice versa. But as I said before, for a complete understanding of Clancy's influence and legacy, both are essential. How am I doing there, Sebastian? Time?
Right on time. If you have any final thoughts, maybe I suggest you share them in the Q&A.
I would do that. I would like to do that. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Keith. Yeah, we're going to take Ben's and Michael's presentations and then go into the Q&A all together to do it in one sitting, so to speak. Ben, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sebastian Erickson, and thank you, Keith, for your great setup remarks here. As Sebastian noted in the intro, I am an active duty Army officer, so I do need to get the disclaimer out the way that my opinions are my own. They do not reflect the U.S. government, Department of Defense, United States Army, or United States Military Academy, except for this one, go Army, beat Navy, as I am obligated to say based off Sebastian's intro here. It's kind of a miracle that this book even exists. And then the follow-on with the movie, and certainly a miracle that it got to the level of popularity that it did. So as Sebastian alluded to in the intro, Tom Clancy got really lucky with the publication here because he was a Maryland insurance agent. He had always been interested in the military. He had wanted to go into the ROTC program at Loyola College of Baltimore, but he was effectively blind, had super thick glasses, was not going to be allowed to join the military. And so sort of the next best thing, working at his wife's insurance agency, sort of midway between Annapolis and Washington, D.C., where he had a whole lot of naval officer clients who he would just drill for information, along with reading things like, Jane's Naval Guide, and then subscribing to the Naval Institute's Proceedings magazine, which is kind of detailing major naval affairs in the U.S. and more broadly. He was able to publish a letter in Proceedings, and so that made him think they liked him a lot. And so he showed up with this book he'd been working on. Just by mere fortune, the press had just decided to publish its first original work of fiction, as long as it was quote unquote wet, having to do with the Navy in some way, shape, or form. And so a whole lot of things happened just to fall into place for Clancy in order for this to work out. The book gets released in 1984, and it's selling okay. It's doing all right in the DC area, a little bit up into New York as well. So a pretty, moderate success. Clancy expresses his satisfaction at having a dust jacket with his name on it. Is kind of the dream of any author, especially any first-time author. I know I was very happy when I saw mine opening up the box as well. So there's nothing to show it was going to be on this trajectory to become, Tom Clancy's brand name, right? Video games, of movies, of books, and TV shows. And so what changed was that a woman by the name of Nancy Reynolds, who had worked for Ronald Reagan as a electronic communications advisor back when he was the governor of California, came across a copy. And she read it while she was flying down to Argentina on some sort of official administration business, and realized that this was the perfect book for Ronald Reagan. Despite his popular image, Ronald Reagan was a lifelong avid reader. He loved books. He loved fiction books and would consume them constantly. There was always something on his nightstand in the White House, throughout his entire life. Science fiction and Westerns being his two favorite genres. And the techno thriller kind of combines both of these, because what Reynolds recognized in the book is that it was the perfect Reagan type of story. Because the story Reagan liked was one that had a clear protagonist who went forth and did the right thing for the right reasons, and then didn't necessarily seek credit at the end of the story, right? The reward of doing what was morally right was sufficient for a Reagan hero. So again, very much the white hat in a cowboy novel. And that's Jack Ryan to a T, right? We see this in both the book and the movie, right? Where he goes and he should have written that memo, but instead he feels compelled to do things personally, which then finds himself being dropped into the choppy Atlantic onto a submarine, and then going on another submersible to another submarine, and doing all these crazy things an analyst should never be doing. But at each point, it's clearly the right thing. And yet at the end of the book, he skips out on that final meeting with the president to fly back home, having accomplished his original objective, which in addition to delivering the information on the ship, was to buy a Christmas gift for his daughter. In the book, it's a skiing Barbie. In the movie, it's the giant teddy bear, which you also see a giant teddy bear in Die Hard as a gift. So I'm not sure if there's a linkage there, and McTiernan just liking giant teddy bears. That story fits Reagan's mold. And so Reynolds gives it to Reagan as a Christmas gift in 1984. Reagan reads it. Again, he has books on his nightstand. He does it before going to bed. But he finds himself unable to sleep because he's just so into this book. Today he shows up at a staff meeting and he's telling everyone, hey, I'm sorry, I'm so tired today. I was up to 2 or 3 in the morning reading this book, The Hunt for Red October. Okay, so the staff, they take the hint. right? The boss is obsessing over this book. He loves this book. And like any good staff officers, they go out and they buy the book. And so then the White House press corps catches on that, hey, wait, why are all these figures buying this random novel? And Ken Edelman, who is the lead nuclear negotiator for Reagan, describes eventually being able to find it after going to several bookstores and only locating it in this really small one in DC because it was misfiled as a work of technical reference as opposed to a work of fiction. And so even again, the people in the bookstores think this is clearly a manual to describe how submarines work, not actually a thriller story. And as the press is catching on this, they'll also report the Soviet embassy has bought numerous copies, presumably to ship back to Moscow for technical analysis. And that's when Reagan calls it unputdownable, calls it the perfect yarn. And that's in February of '85. In March of '85, Clancy gets to visit the White House, has a brief meeting with Reagan, and then a luncheon put together with a number of senior defense officials in the Reagan administration. This is where Secretary of the Navy John Lehman reportedly told Clancy that his response on reading the book was, "Who the hell cleared this?" Because the presumption that there was classified material in the book. And prior to its publication, the Naval Institute Press did require a couple of Navy captains to look at the book in order to make sure that it was unclassified. So similar to what Keith was talking about with his plankton story, one captain was like, "No, you can't publish this." And then Clancy had to walk him through everything where he found it in open source. Again, things like Jane's, things like proceedings, being where he's pulling from to get all of this out there. So again, it's a great story. I mean, I love the book, but it is odd. And as I was going through this project, why is Ronald Reagan pushing this book, using the power of the presidency to get this book out there? And the reason for it is that it very much captures his first term national defense objectives. Right. So Reagan had for a long time, dating back to his very early days, had this belief that a democratic society, if it puts its best people into place and gives them the best technology, that is how freedom prospers and anything is possible. He says as much in his remarks to the Air Force Academy, but again, it's one of these animating things of his kind of political life. And again, this is Clancy, right? In the book, every U.S. service member is virtuous and good and performs their job with an insane amount of proficiency. The worst thing said about any American service member in the book is that he's kind of a jerk to work for, but he gets the job done. And so again, that's a very faint criticism of an admiral in the book there. Now, other people, particularly Senate staffers, are deemed as high risk. Anyone involved in oversight of intelligence of the military is a risk in Clancy's telling, which Reagan probably also appreciated. Importantly, in the book, too, all the technology works. Right, a flight of A-10s coming off of continental U.S. airbase scares off the Russian aircraft carrier. The only place the Soviets have an advantage is the Red October, which is important because it's fictional. That tech doesn't exist, and my understanding is it couldn't possibly exist, but I'll leave that to our Submariner to confirm or deny. And so, again, good people plus good tech equals good results. And this is what Reagan had been trying to bring back into the public discourse throughout his presidency. In his first year in office, he's coming here to West Point in order to give what's going to be a major foreign policy speech. The first draft of this speech had a really interesting paragraph. And that paragraph was just excoriating Hollywood. It was criticizing their reprehensible pandering to anti-American sentiment. And in the margin, there were a couple of movies that were listed. So you have Apocalypse Now, The Deer Hunter, Killing Field, all great movies, all Oscar-winning movies that all don't necessarily portray the United States and its service members in the best light, right? Comparing, the U.S. in Vietnam to the Belgians in the Congo is certainly not something that the administration would want to embrace and have get out there. And so Reagan wants people's perspective of the military change as he's working to increase defense budget, increase the tools that are getting out to the military in this time period. And so by the time, he's looking at re-election in '84, seeing a narrative that so perfectly captures these ideas is something that brings him a lot of joy and something he wants to kind of push to get out there. And Clancy, for his part, is doing this intentionally, right? He is seeing what Reagan is putting down in the first years in office and is actively incorporating these themes and ideas into his writing. In a letter he writes to the president after the meeting, he wants to express that, anything I can do to help you out, please let me know. I am very much interested in doing that, right? He had a long reputation as being a very reliable Republican in Maryland. He'd written as congressman for a signed picture of Reagan, and the congressman was like, yeah, absolutely. Endorsed that to Reagan, again, noting that he was a lifelong and loyal Republican. In his letters, Tom Clancy, Jack Ryan being his fictional avatar, notes that he voted for Reagan 4 times. The only time he didn't was in the 1980 primary when he voted for George Bush. And Clancy notes that, well, nobody's perfect, it was his mistake. And so, again, he's actively trying to incorporate this narrative because he genuinely believes in it in this book. And that's kind of this mutually reinforcing relationship then between Ronald Reagan and Tom Clancy. This continues throughout the remainder of time Reagan has in office. Red Storm Risings, the book review of that calls it good news for Mr. Weinberger, the Secretary of Defense, because again, all the technology works perfectly. All the people on the American side are virtuous and good. The Cardinal of the Kremlin is a book about really SDI. And one of the final scenes of the book sees Jack Ryan encounter the Soviet premier and having this exchange in which the Soviet premier tells him, Jack Ryan, you sound like your president. And Jack Ryan saying, well, the president is right, which is basically the thesis of that novel, is that Reagan is right on SDI and we need to defend that, right? So again, this relationship continues to grow, and Reagan continues to read and love Tom Clancy novels. He reads Red Storm Rising shortly after it comes out in August of '86. He references it while flying to Reykjavik. He recommends Margaret Thatcher read it in order to better understand the conventional picture in Europe. And so there's a lot going on there. Where I'll close with is just a quick note about the movies, right? Because again, I think Keith did a great job talking about this idea of the submarine mythos and the tension that you get when he puts something underwater, which is again why Clancy set his book on submarine instead of on a frigate like his inspiration was, is that it adds that dramatic tension of not being able to find it, of what's going on underwater, of fighting nature and man and hunting and all this great stuff. The movie has its public debut at the White House. That is where its first public screening is. And that's because George H.W. Bush is also a big fan of Tom Clancy and wants to see the movie as soon as possible. So he is able to get a copy of it several weeks before it was due to have its public release. And they have a big party at the White House that features a mix of administration officials and a mix of the actors from the movie in order to push this forward. So Clancy's legacy continuing into the Bush years. And so I'll pause there. I'm happy to talk more about any of this in the Q&A. But again, thank you for the opportunity, and I'm looking forward to more discussion.
Thank you very much, Ben. Excellent presentation as well. Without further ado, Michael, the floor is yours.
Well, yes, thank you. And it was very interesting to listen to my predecessors. It's just great. And I learned a lot of new stuff, especially from Ben, because I had not so far the chance to read his book. I will certainly do that now. Let me take you a little bit back in time. In the year 1984, when the book came out, I was a junior officer. I was also XO of a German small submarine, coastal submarine, very much focused on the Baltic Sea, but it was Cold War. And we frequently had contact with Soviet warships at that time, or Warsaw Pact warships to be actual. But I was also so lucky to have several times encountered with Russian submarines, not necessarily the nuclear ones, but certainly also nuclear armed ones, but conventionally propulsed, because these were in the Baltic. In 1985, I was picked for an exchange with the Royal Navy, and I did an XO course in Faslane, Scotland. That's the main base of the UK submarine force. And I did the course together with 2 UK submariners of SSNs, with a Norwegian submariner and with 2 Israeli submariners of that time. And it opened very much my submarine horizon, and especially the teacher of our course, which was also the teacher of the UK Command Officer Qualifying course, recommended us to get this book, Hunt for Red October, and to read it. And his explanation was that will give you a broader picture, a picture of all the working together of the different weapon systems and the situation in the Barents Sea and in the North Atlantic. Well, I bought this book in a Glasgow bookshop, and I read it, and indeed it opened my eyes, because of course I know much more secret things. I do, of course, know how submarines, at least our conventional, worked. But what I did not realize is how the chain of command above German authorities in NATO would work, in the US would work, or they were thought by Tom Clancy work in the Soviet Union, nowadays Russia. In '86, I did the Command Officer Qualifying course. I had the license to drive a German submarine, and I was sent to the Netherlands doing a ASW course, just to learn the opposite thing. That is quite frequently done in navies. And in that course, I finally came had the chance to see the movie. Funny thing is, nowadays, before preparing for the session, I obviously mixed together the movie and the book, because I remembered some things very strong and thought all the time, and I now reviewed the movie. Well, when is happening that? That doesn't happen. Other things, when I read the book and thought, oh, yeah, that is the situation, did not happen. So as Keith said, they are both standing for their own, and they're both worthful. And well, I have a lot of friends in my function as head of the German Submariners Association, and that is covering also US nuclear submarine sailors of that time, as well as former Soviet Union sailors, as well in Russia. Of course, the contact to that country is a little bit difficult and not done by me, but some of them are living in Ukraine. And for instance, they are running the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power station. It's a job for old nuclear submarine drivers and engineers. And I asked them about this movie. Of course, in the US, everyone knows the movie. In Ukraine, or in, say, Soviet Union, nowadays Russia, no, it's not very popular there. That's funny. So I argued with my Ukrainian friend, and he organized to see the movie in Russian language. It's possible. And afterwards, I'm now getting every second day a new submarine movie question from him to me, and not answered my questions to him. So all the movies Keith referred to, which are pieces of the end of Cold War or the reflecting of the Cold War afterwards, are now in my mind. And some of them are very, very, very good. Hunt for Red October has, of course, also a lot of faults, mistakes. And now you would ask me, why are you then deeming this movie and this book so worthy for you and for your understanding? And that is still the case today. Rereading the book, I was surprised how correct the depiction of the working together of the different things, higher commands, White House briefing room, politician behavior, understanding of scientists, that is all very, very good. Of course, there are minor questions like, is the dress correct, which a former military is looking to, or where they really do smoking. You know, in German submarines, we never smoke. By the way, in the movie and in the book, they smoke on both submarines. Which one is the fault? Sebastian, any idea? Well, the US were at that time allowed to smoke in submarines. They canceled this habit only in, I wrote it anywhere down, 2010. After working on that bad habit for more than 20 years. The first US CO who banned smoking on his ship was the commanding officer of the Theodore Roosevelt, and that already in 1993. So it was a long way. But in the Russian Navy, they never smoked on submarines, neither conventional nor nuclear. My friends told me, well, on the bigger one, like the Typhoon, he was on a sister ship, well, of the fictional Red October, they had a small chamber to smoke in, 3 persons fitting in. It must be great to have a room like a small sauna and getting full of nicotine. Perhaps another question, they were also not allowed to drink. They had the possibility for the evening meal, 50 milliliters of white sweet wine, but that's it, nothing else on board. In Germany, we drink beer on board. Well, I found it interesting. So why do submariners like the book and the movie? Well, we feel correctly depicted. Why that? And perhaps it's a little bit like we would like to be depicted. Submariners are aggressive, self-assured, and very, very bright. Very nice. Or US submarine commanding officers are legendary. There is perhaps a little bit, one is tempered, one is a thing, but that's reflecting to nearly all persons. Or here, that is my favorite one. A submarine crew is like a family. The XO is keeping it together and working as a mother. Or another one, it's an idiosyncratic club, a little bit quirky, of Deutsch kauzig, and they are permanently overriding regulations. I don't say we are doing that, but we would like to do, and we are feeling very good descripted here. Of course, and that is a very worthwhile point from Ben, if I may say so. There were a lot of things which were in publications like Jane's, like Proceedings, like the German Marine Forum. You can find it everywhere, perhaps also in the New York Times. But altogether, it's giving a good picture. And you had never a chance to having that in a picture overall. And I remember me on my course in the Netherlands that we sat at a moment where we were learning ASW procedures from a NATO book, a NATO regulation book. It's ATP 28. And it describes how submarines behave, how the opponent submarines, the possible opponent submarines behave. And we said, well, this regulation book is as old as the Bible. It's basing on World War II theory. It's describing convoy operations. It's how submarines fight a convoy, the Wolfpack tactic at that time. But to learn how a submarine operates, how a submarine can be hunted, that is in Tom Clancy's book. And he did the same with Red Storm Rising for all the other weapon systems. So that was a great thing, and therefore also military people like this novel, and I can perfectly understand what Ben is telling, that Ronald Reagan and his staff and his admirals and his generals liked these stories. That makes really sense. You know, only as a military, you know very often small pieces. And you very often get angry about politicians or even military leaders who tell you your job is to ask questions. Even that situation is in the book, where he's sitting in the briefing room and the political advisor of the president is trying to get him nailed on, well, we are doing exercises during this time of the year. Yes, and the admiral, very cool, said, one of the admirals, I think name is Foster, said, hey, that is Bermuda, but we are talking about the Barents Sea. Yeah, so it's a little bit a difference in wintertime. Tom Clancy is making very often the story about ambivalences. So the characters are either perfect, and on the other hand, they have some mistakes. But the same is, by the way, the case for technical systems, submarines, and things like that. But therefore, he is gathering the atmosphere, and I still like the book, and I still like the film. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. Excellent, as always. Thank you to the three of you, the three speakers. While we have about 40 minutes for Q&A, let me just say that if you are now thinking about a question, you can either put it into the chat function and I will read it or present it to the people, or as Heinz-Dieter Jopp has already done, raise your hand and then we will unmute you, or you'll have to unmute yourself and you'll have the floor. While you collect the questions, I will use my distinct role as chair of this to ask the three individual speakers one question each to elaborate a little bit on some of these things. For Keith, my question is this, and it's more an assumption than really a question. You spoke a lot about the U-boat mythos and the sort of what's being transported in the movies and in novels and these kind of things. It strikes me that we have most of these submarine works of fiction are either on German submarines, think Das Boot, think U-751, or American submarines, think Hunt for Red October, and perhaps Soviet or Russian submarines. I wonder if there's is there a disbalance? You know, I'm looking at all the other submarine fielding nations. Do we just not see the novels and the films that are coming out of, the UK or France or other countries? Is this a sort of deformation professionnelle that we have here, that we really just look at the vast body of German, American, and Russian and Soviet submarine movies and novels? And my question for Ben is, if you look at the 1980s and sort of the pop culture items that came out of this on the security defense front, so to speak, you've got Hunt for Red October and you've got Top Gun, arguably two really good movies and books, but two pieces that are very much speaking towards the Navy. And of course, this is the time of the 600-ship Navy and the maritime strategy. In the course of your research, did you come across people who were either trying to push or similar narratives for the United States Army, or did you come across people who were extremely critical of the Reagan presidency using popular culture in that way, trying to amplify naval matters for that matter. And finally, from the question for Michael, as you in your current position try to advocate for a larger, at least to the outside, a larger submarine force in the German Navy, a submarine flotilla, or at least one that's properly sourced and equipped and financed. How often? I imagine you and do stop me here if I'm off track, but I imagine when you talk to policymakers and to the broader public about submarines, they'll either think of Das Boot or they will think of Hunt for Red October. And of course, neither is correct for the kind of submarines that the German Navy is operating and will be procuring in the next few years or so. So, if the three gentlemen would be so kind to respond to that, perhaps Keith, you want to kick us off, and then Ben, and then Michael.
Sure. I think trying to understand your question. I mean, first of all, there's a substantial amount of literature on American submarines in novels and in nonfiction that are out there. And when you look at what's happened really since Clancy and since sort of the opening up of the Cold War, and of course the nature of the espionage, the covert war that was going on, and is back again dramatically, particularly as you look at headlines in the newspaper back. Remember 2 years ago, the Belgorod vanished. The headline said vanished, and they couldn't find out where it was. And of course, submarines have a way of vanishing. They aren't often easily found. But part of it, the concern was that it's a renewed intensification of this whole fear we had. I mean, I started off in elementary school in the 50s with duck and cover, as we learned to avoid Soviet bombers. And then, in the 50s, we developed the nuclear submarines and then ballistic missiles. And so now we have the Belgorod, which has a new weapon system, the Poseidon system, that is basically can launch autonomous nuclear torpedoes to take out coastal infrastructure in coastal cities. And, is that a first strike weapon? Because to jump ahead, and this is not your question, but one of the major differences between the book and the film in Red October is the emphasis in the film is more on the first strike weapon, which to me really struck at a major concern if you look back at what was going on throughout the world. And I was in Germany in some of those years, and there was a lot of protest against nuclear weapons, intensification, even whole questions coming up, to what degree was Brezhnev in control of the Soviet military with the hardliners? And now as we learn more about how much has went on after Clancy's book raised a lot of questions. So we have a lot of books out there in the market, both British books. There's an excellent British book on their submariner experience in the Cold War. And I also have seen reference to other films featuring, submarines, Indian films, and so forth. So I think there's a total renewed interest and a topical interest in what the future is. I mean, one of my funniest stories, and I'll just tell that one, is I discovered this article in Naval Times. Some of you may have seen it. It was in the April issue, but it announced that the Americans had developed a new Caterpillar stealth submarine. And it went on and on about it was going to be the Montana, the USS Montana, which is being fitted. But of course, it wasn't going to be fitted, most likely not going to be fitted exactly, to ballistic missiles because, boomers are not designed to be anything more than retaliatory. It didn't want to send a bad message. And it ended up with, I think the last words were something about the stealth technology, the Caterpillar drive was, the holy grail of submarine warfare. Well, I think it's not the only grail it is when I look at some of the technologies that they're talking about, using space-based lasers, combining AI with all sorts of other weapons. And by the way, the ones they spotted over Hawaii, thinking that they were going to evaluate wave height to detect submarines, they were green lasers. So I don't know if that has any other connotations. And just one other final comment so I can get it in, Ben, is, I never understood and figured, why is Van Pelt in the movie eating jelly beans? I mean, it's almost a tribute to Reagan. And I never understood that again until seeing it. So I could go on with talking about this because it's a subject we all enjoy, but that's my response to your question.
Thanks.
So thanks for the great question, Sebastian. And yeah, Keith, that's absolutely a Reagan reference in the movie. And the president in Hunt for October is not named, but is clearly a Reagan stand-in. The way that Clancy describes him in the book ends up matching the way Clancy describes Reagan's charisma and personality after their first Oval Office meeting. So I think that's another part of the reason why Reagan likes the book, sees himself in there portrayed as strong, intelligent, and getting one over on the Soviets. Sebastian, to your question, looking at this pop culture influence on other branches, particularly on the Army, yes, there is. So first off, the Army is somewhat jealous that the Navy's gotten all this great free publicity, and they want in on it. So they open up to both Clancy and then Larry Bond, who's working on Red Storm Rising with Clancy. They get to go out and they get a ride in an M1 tank. They get to go out to the very recently opened National Training Center at Fort Irwin, California, to help with further books, basically. Colin Powell actually is the one who gives Clancy the idea for Clear and Present Danger, right? So he had met Clancy at this event in Tennessee in the late 1980s, and they strike it off and become very good friends. That lasts all the way through the end of Clancy's life. And so Powell describes some of the things the Army's doing in the drug war, and Clancy takes that, kind of bolts it on to another book idea he had, and that then becomes Clear and Present Danger. In terms of other authors, Team Yankee by Harold Coyle would be one that kind of pops in on that. The books by W.B. Griffin, no relation to me, also kind of got there. He has ones going through sort of all the ranks, telling these ground combat stories. Larry Bond has a few ground-based techno thrillers as well in this time, so they're all kind of there. Movie-wise, there's not as much that pairs this virtuous service member with high technology. Of course, you have Rambo 2, which is sort of the kind of counterweight to the Vietnam syndrome. Do we get to win this time? Special forces focus. You can make some argument for Red Dawn and Wolverines as this ground combat insurgent force, but neither one of those is really goosing Army recruitments. Neither is G.I. Joe, which returns in the 1980s. And then movie-wise, Firebirds, a really unfortunate Apache-based wannabe Top Gun movie that comes out in 1990 is probably the best. They don't capture the magic the same way. Clancy and McTiernan actually do want to make an Army movie after Hunt for October. They think that the Battle of 73 Easting is the perfect kind of story to tell for that, with H.R. McMaster being sort of the central figure character in that. They get a first draft of it together, but it never actually gets off the ground into production. HBO also optioned the rights for Red Storm Rising, but didn't end up filming it because it's just too expensive at the time to make. Lots of criticism of this approach from outside the administration. So there's a case when Newt Gingrich actually holds aloft Red Storm Rising in a debate in the floor on the House, talking about how important the book is. Another rep says that, ASET technology wins us the war. And the Democrat responds by this is complete fantasy. This is farcical. How can you be taking this seriously? And then Reagan's often criticized for sort of embellishing the facts on the stories that he's got. This all is probably most evident in the debate around SDI. So it's less, Tom Clancy's involved in this with Cardinal the Kremlin, but the science fiction community in America gets heavily invested in this with Robert Heinlein on the pro-SDI side, and Isaac Asimov and Arthur Clarke on the anti-SDI side. And they're all getting sucked into congressional testimony, into newspaper articles to comment about the feasibility of this technology, and try and work it into their fiction in ways. And so it becomes a very nasty debate that breaks up their friendships. And again, really splits science fiction in America in ways that are still kind of lingering, actually. So yes, lots of criticism of this sort of approach of using fiction to advance political narratives.
Thanks. Michael.
Yes, here I am. Well, referring to the question for Keith, there are also French submarine movies. Yes. I lately saw a quite good taking place on the French nuclear submarines. They're a little bit newer than not 40 years old, perhaps 20 or so. They're playing on the French Ruby class. Also, a point Keith made with the jelly beans, very interesting to hear. I was not aware that Reagan was eating them. But the interesting question for me, why is, for instance, the political officer of Russian, the Politruk. First, his name is Putin. Strange. At that time, Putin does not play a role. I think he was still working in Dresden. And I asked my Russian friends, or my Ukrainian friends, sorry about this mishap, Putin is a very, very seldom name. The guy said in 20 years of service in the Soviet Navy, he never came across a guy named Putin. I was not aware of that. So that is strange that that is in the movie. And also the killing, the murder, we must say, of the political officer. Why? For what? Again, my friends from Ukraine said, well, a Politruk has not at all the power this guy obviously should have in the movie, or we think in the Western world. It's a sort of advisor. In German language, we would say it's a Lehrer für politische Bildung, a teacher for political understanding. And there is another guy, which is normally not, it's the guy, it's a cook, I think, or one of the cooks. KGB did frequently put in crew members during longer missions of the submarines. So if the mission was longer than 78 days or went to different places, by the way, the Russians never went with submarines like that to Cuba. They normally never went to foreign harbors with submarines, with nuclear submarines. Conventional submarines, yes, they are going to Algeria, they were going to Tartus in Syria, like today, and they were going also to, which is now Montenegro, Tivat, former times Yugoslavia. But nuclear submarines, not, of course not. But it would be a nice idea for submariners to make an interesting trip. And we have also this reaction in the movie of the crew. Yes, we are going to Cuba. Great, no? Ladies, music, rum, good. Submariners like that. My question, do Germany need a larger submarine force nowadays? Well, the submarine force was shrink down as a result of the peace dividend. Of course, we need some more. The actual commander of the German submarine squadron and also his superiors, they are planning for 9 to 12. 12 submarines would be comfortable. 9 submarines instead of the actual 6 would be a solution. And I think the question was also from Sebastian, if I had a feeling how decision makers have a knowledge about the movies Das Boot and Hunt for Red October. Honestly, I like Hunt for Red October much more than Das Boot. Das Boot gives you the life on a submarine, the dirt, no shower, seasickness, things like that. Hunt for Red October, everything is clean, perfect, super, at least on the US submarines. But having discussed, as a submariner, you always are the sort of specialist for submarine movies. So if the people see one, they come to you with questions. Do we have enough submarines? Do we have the right submarines? What is the weapon system working like? And there is Hunt for Red October much more the picture of today, still the picture of today. The submarine is no more hunted by surface forces. At least the submarine is superior. The weapon range, the sensor range of a submarine is 3-4 times the one than a surface ship. So if I was referring to friends and families explaining the systems of a submarines, I always referred to Hunt for Red October. I don't have the impression that our decision makers, our politicians are aware of Hunt for Red October. They certainly are aware of Das Boot, and you always have to defend ideas that the passive situation of the World War II is the situation of 1943, 1944, and not comparable with the situation either in the Cold War or today. Yes, I think that's it.
Well, thank you very much. Niklas Granholm from Sweden has reminded us that the French movie is called Chanteloup, which translates into The Wolf's Call. I think it's been on Netflix, at least in Germany, and I recommend everyone to watch it. I indeed forgot that it exists, but I watched it. We have a question from Heinz-Dieter Jopp, if he is still with us in this group. I know he raised his hand earlier. Heinz-Dieter?
I'm still there. I don't know why it's not functioning with the video, but it's not a direct question, but it's just, and you know my own personal history, it's just a remembering on my situation when I start after finishing my Admiral Staff course in Hamburg in a German think tank, at that time still near Munich, later, and now it's in Berlin. And when I started there, I asked the Navy, but the Navy at that time was not interested in a specific study. So I started just for my own. And I studied with a principal idea to look for modern technologies, still not in the navies of the world, but maybe in 15 years, and ask myself how that can change the way of naval warfare in the future. That means at that time, the year 2000. And I started a first working paper, and in the end, it called Strategic Anti-Submarine Warfare. And why I named it in that way, yes, that was in one part due to the new book, The Hunt for Red October, because what I have learned there, and that was one thing that told me when I have been in this institute. First of all, when you work, remember, use open sources, not secret sources, because then they can fight. Every word you were writing, they can fight you. And so that was beautiful when I have finished my working paper on strategic submarine warfare, the reaction by our Chief of Naval Office was that is a level too high for the Germans because that is strategic. Beautiful for me. But in the end, what I learned, first of all, the way how the attack submarines of the US Navy or the British Navy are going behind the strategic submarines of the Soviet Navy at that time. That means these versions of trailing. And in the end, that was just a starting point for my future work. As I said, after 2.5 years, I finished my study on the future of naval warfare. And at later stages, I'm just following new technologies in asking myself, and therefore in writing articles, asking the people to think more in that direction and not in the old direction. And I think that is one thing, and Sebastian is so familiar with that, where we still have the principal problems with our politicians and with many, many other people. It's so difficult to start with them a discussion on the possibility of future technologies and how that will change the way of fighting. Nowadays, we are discussing drones in the war between Russia and Ukraine. But drones would have been possible much more beforehand. In my book, which was ready in 1989, I made an offer to the German Navy, said, think about submarines and a new weapon on them. That means a sea-launched cruise missile, the Tomahawk, and then maybe reaching the Kola Peninsula. And that was a killing argument for my own, because they sent me to other jobs. No, that is not the right way we are trying to think. So in the end, what we still need also in the year 2024 is we need more people like Sebastian, but also like others, which are willing to go in the direction of this thinking ahead and not to thinking behind. And that was main effect. I know it's more common, but that was the work done by Tom Clancy and Hunt for Red October and the later on books too, just to convince me your way ahead is you have to look to modern technologies and ask always the same. And as it has been mentioned, yes, you can find information either in articles in the New York Times or the Washington Post or some others. So it's relative easy, but you have to do that work. And sometimes it's very difficult. And nowadays I'm working and ask myself about the future of the Chinese Navy in that direction too, and how that will bring them together, the US Navy and the Chinese Navy. Thank you that you have been heard to my comments.
Thank you, Dieter. Very much appreciate your comment, and of course the work you've been doing for almost 40 years, at least more than 40 years. And I will take the compliment to my own work. I've been referred to as Germany's Jack Ryan, so I don't know if that means anything, but we do try to think ahead at the ISPK, but also connected with recent history. I have a couple more questions, and then we'll wrap up. We'll give the three speakers a chance to reflect. One question is more broader, not really related to the movie or the book, but I'll field it, and people might be interested in trying to answer it. It comes from the chat, and participant Carl Bender writes or asks, does a conventional submarine of today has a higher chance of surviving than the ones in the 1980s or in the Second World War? I know that's probably for another day, and of course, answers of those are probably classified, but Keith, Michael, and Ben might, if you were so inclined to answer on that, you would be invited. But before you do, the final question comes from Berlin, from Jonas.
Yes, hello. Jonas Orseksdal from Berlin, but Swedish. Thanks for an interesting. I will be looking forward afternoon. I'll be looking forward to this. My question is quite short. And reflection, I think we have been talking and comparing Das Boot with the Hunt for Red October. A couple of years after Buchheim published the book, there was kind of a reply from notably also Carl Friedrich Mertens, who was a submarine commander during the Second World War, and said, "Nein, so war das nicht." That is, no, Buchheim, you're wrong. Has there been anything like that coming after Red October, that professional submariners in some way would have so publicly argued that this is pure fiction, has nothing to do with the reality? Because both books have been acclaimed for being realistic in their own sense. Does anyone know this?
Thank you, Jonas. Excellent question as always. I suggest we go the other way around. So we'll start with Michael and then Ben and Keith for responses and final comments for today's session.
Okay, the answer is quite easy for Jonas. Nein, so war das nicht is a Dönitz-initiated reply. Actually, that's true. Dönitz wrote letter to the guy who wrote this book and said, we, World War II submariners, have to do something against Das Boot. And I have a letter from him testimonying that. And the guy who wrote this letter, he was a former submarine commander in World War II, but they were more referring to the behavior of the people on Das Boot. They are more referring to the situation of thinking on board, of the, well, you know, the Buchheim guys are doing ugly things on board, and nobody want to say, yes, in my youth I did the same during World War. No, you perhaps remember the opening of the movie Das Boot, and therefore also Buchheim disliked the movie because it was putting some ugly things, which are, I think, a privilege of the youth and the youth, and also a privilege of people under pressure in war, too much for the people. The German submariners of World War II like to be, well, we did our job, we were heroes a little bit, and only through to technical disaster, things like that, we lost the war. No. So no comparison with Red Storm Rising. I have never heard of anything against that. But that is, of course, also because the US submariners are the great good guys. Nobody is making mistakes. Everyone is an artist. Remember the sonar operator. By the way, totally nonsense. Huh? You cannot just hear and say, oh, that's a Victor 3. And it's a long process, I tell you, and you need decent equipment and looking in the decent equipment. And I was responsible for German-US encountering how good are US nuclear submarines. Of course, I cannot tell you everything, but honestly, they're not so good as in the movie. And even not 20 years later, yeah? So that is the truth. What I would like to refer to the question of the conventional submarine. Has it a higher chance of surviving? Well, if you refer to World War II, of course. Because if you're referring to World War II, you speak normally of the submarines operational at that time. And as we all certainly know, at the end of the war, there were new submarines, Type 23, Type 21, which were the foundation of a new submarine concept, where we still in conventional submarines live today. Is a conventional submarine of today better chance of surviving than the ones in 1980? Well, it's still the same system. Some things are now more advanced, and in submarines, the technical development went forward all the time. And even if we speak about conventional submarines, now the sonar system is better, the weapons is better, the propulsion is better. A conventional submarines means today it has an air-independent propulsion. So a conventional submarine is in nothing different from a nuclear submarine, only perhaps the speed and the time to stay at sea. The weapons can be the same. You only have to have them on board. Yeah. So I would say has a higher chance of surviving. The ASW weapons and the ASW equipment did not make so much progress. However, at the moment, and I think that was in the opening of Sebastian, we are looking to, or was it Keith, where we are thinking about 2050, 2045. There might be a change because at the moment, unmanned system, lasers, the ASWD weapons have at least technological in the basic development, some things which might bring the submarine again in a very much hunted role. We have that in sonar, bistatic things a little bit today, but you don't find the systems at sea now. So at the moment, I would say, yes, the conventional submarine of today has nearly the same chance of surviving than in the 80s. A little bit better because you have this air-independent propulsion, or better. And the weapons are a little bit better, but not in 100, 200% better. But at least against World War II, yes. By the way, the guy, I did not understand the name. I think it was Dieter, who came from the German think tank or had worked there. It's surprising. He already asked for Tomahawk weapons, cruise missiles on German submarines in, was it 89? I think 89. Incredible. We still do not have these weapons on board today. And that is certainly a thing we have to ask for. Sebastian, you also put that in your latest article together with Joop, when you said, well, we have to have more weapons like that. We don't have to have them on surface forces. I don't want to sail a corvette in the Baltic Sea in a state of war, but I certainly want to have them on submarines because they have the reach to do that in the Baltic and have an easy access with the range of these weapons, and that must be Tomahawk and not, say, RSP-60 or so. It must be Tomahawk with a range of 500 miles, and then it's even endangering the capital of a potential opponent, and at least all the military installations. And it could be easy done. Tomahawk will fit in a submarine tube, torpedo tube, and could be fired from there. Other nations do have that. Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. You've just given us at least 2 new topics for further roundtables. So Ben, the floor is yours, and then Keith.
Sorry about that. Thank you. Yeah, so I think, Jonas, great question talking about the realism versus the accuracy, because that's one of the huge hallmarks of the whole techno thriller genre is it's got to be good enough, right? It's not going to be perfect. As kind of we've noted throughout here, there are certainly mistakes that are made in terms of some of the behaviors, some of the things tactics-wise that are done. But yeah, you don't want to have something where people in that community are coming out and saying that this is absolute bunk. And so the people, the ones that are taking off tend to be pretty good. And there's a lot of attention being put into making sure there's as accurate as possible. And I think something that I appreciate about Heinz's comments, where he's talking about working with open source as opposed to secret, because that has a big part of this as well. So Larry Bond was in the Navy, and the Navy, when he was in it, had a secret tabletop game to practice fleet tactics. It was a pain in the butt to use, though, because to use it, you'd have to go into the skiff, you have to get it out, sign it out, put everything back in, and you really couldn't talk about what you'd done with it, after you were out of the, secret area. And so he decided to make a unclassed version, right? And that's the birth of Harpoon, which is a tabletop naval war game that still has multiple iterations coming out now. And Tom Clancy is playing Harpoon, and he writes Larry Bond a letter telling him how useful it was as he was thinking through the plot lines for Hunt for October. That leads to their relationship, which leads to Red Storm Rising. In Red Storm Rising, they are using Harpoon to kind of game out how the Soviet attack on the U.S. carrier group would look. That's the Dance of the Valkyries chapter in there. At one point, Larry was telling me how Clancy had written himself into a corner in Hunt for October about how they were going to realistically get out of the end of the situation in the book, until he saw the two models he had of the Typhoon and the Kilo, and realized, oh, the Typhoon could ram the Kilo basically, and survive that, whereas the Kilo would not. I have no qualifications to talk about the survivability of submarines, so I'm glad that Michael did that previously. There are criticisms of using these books, and they do center around this discussion of are they accurate or not, because again, everything that happens in there happens for a narrative purpose, and so yes, they're trying to make it realistic, but they're trying to make sure that it is still serving the purpose of the story. That's also using the Fusnik cargo ship in Red Storm Rising to host a Soviet paratrooper unit, right? They checked the measurements that it could physically do this. I doubt there's any Soviet war plan that calls for using a giant cargo container as a launching platform for airborne forces, though. So yeah, I think the ones that are succeeding and doing well do have that hallmark of being accurate enough. And what accurate enough, realistic enough is kind of all in the eye of the beholder. But I think there is still that general kind of mass within the communities that agree on that one.
Thank you very much. Keith.
I love Michael's answer. His question was spot on. The only thing I would add on to the conventional submarine is the fact that wasn't it the Swedish Gotland that in a war game, quote unquote, sank the Ronald Reagan?
Yeah, I think you're just about right. Yeah.
And that wasn't exactly the first time a relatively low-tech submarine, in other words, a diesel submarine, which in fact they aren't, considering what Michael had to say. But certainly when you look at the open source information that you have available, that was a really good comment. Particularly when I was amazed at how much I found in doing the research for this presentation, how much I was into in terms of equipment and looking at submarine developments for the future. And I also then think back when I was at the Navy sub school. I was there for, well, it took me 6 months to complete my visit with them, because I had to go back to be on every sub I could get on, but also to see the simulations that they were using, and including, by the way, they have one for commanders where they go through simulations to do this, and I'm assuming this is what Clancy saw, and but the thing that struck me is this is after the fall of the wall, the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and there were all these new buildings, construction at the sub school, and they were all to be the housing for the new Seawolf class submarine, which was to be the ultimate stealth submarine. And of course, there's 3 of them now, and they quit, after we got our peace dividend. And they're used on very high-tech, covert operations that we don't know about today. And, you know, all that was stopped. If you look ahead at the arguments for what they're doing with the Virginia class or the Columbia, in terms, it looks like they're going back more to what they were trying to do with Seawolf. But of course, now we're into the whole issue of how long does it take to get submarines built? And you go back to the issue of capacity, and you go back into the numbers of nations, both pro-democracy and anti-democracy, that are building submarines, and you have to worry about the issue of numbers having their own quantity again. So, but I thought that was a really good answer. I would just add to a couple comments quickly that I wanted to say is that, you know, Ryan really represents a new kind of hero, Sebastian, someone who is with ingenuity, who thinks his way through a problem. He runs towards a problem. He makes up a mind. He's decisive. He's a risk taker, and people listen to him. Even his words where he tries to be quiet, they pick up on what he says. So it's a new kind of action hero before we got into all the Marvel comic characters that we see in films today. So, and I do say that, you know, the accuracy was very apparent in the film, and I did not pick up other than what was said. You know, there were inaccuracies, there were things that were taken for dramatic license and so forth, as you would expect, but overall the reception's been very, very strong. And the other thing too is, if you ever haven't had a chance to be on a submarine, whether it's at a World War II, you know, memorial sub, or to look even at the modern ones, I've been on Sturgeon class and both and the improved Los Angeles class. You get a whole different sense for the interaction of people on the boat. I mean, I love the bubbleheads I met on American submarines. I also had a chance to work closely with several chiefs of the boat, and there's a whole other school in terms of the camaraderie and the way in which that they interact. I also had a chance to see how they educate submariners, and how after someone comes off a patrol, every single sailor is interviewed from the standpoint of what did you learn and how does this relate to your training. And when I saw how they computerized it, and this is in the mid-90s, I said, how come you haven't talked to people in higher education? Because this is how we should be learning. And I welcomed them to join the American higher education community in terms of their training methods. So I think, you know, in terms of the future and in terms of what we see, the battle in Congress, why we're not prioritizing submarines, given the questions that are at hand, I think is a real issue, and particularly to reinforce the whole submarine mythos and its effect, to hear the fact that you know, there was a proposal to arm with cruise missiles or with other missiles German submarines, and it was something that no one wanted to hear politically. It reminds you of the close connection, for good or for bad, between politics, policy, and the military, which Ben was bringing up. So this has been an excellent presentation. I have probably far more questions and observations and feel like there's more work to be done, Sebastian.
Well, thanks, Keith, and thanks to the other two speakers. You know, there's a rumor, at least on Twitter, for what it's worth, that Hollywood is thinking about doing well, either a follow-up to Hunt for Red October as a movie, or a revision. I'm slightly anxious about that. I don't know where that's leading, and I think you know, they should try their hand at Red Storm Rising, but that's, I think, for another day. I want to thank all of you for participating in today's debate. Of course, in particular, our three speakers, Keith Bird, Michael Setzer, and Ben Griffin. Do keep in touch with ISPK, and in the meantime, stay healthy, stay sharp, and remember, one ping only. Thank you very much.